Today we're going to be looking at some of the most essential basses in modern house music. We really spent a lot of time scouring the Beatport charts, figuring out what's working, and our goal is to give you sort of anchor points in your brain so you can figure out where does my signature sound fall, right? If you know how to make a deep house FM bass, and you know how to make an aggressive house bass, then you can start triangulating and figure out, okay, which pieces of this do I use and which pieces of this technique do I use to make my own sort of secret sauce, right? So let's do it. So first up, guys, we've got the Chris Lake bouncer here, and we'll give the example a little listen. And just soloing the basses as well. So it can add a nice bouncy feel to your track, right? If things are feeling a little bit static, you can dial in a patch like this. And what you're gonna wanna do is reach for a wavetable synth, so something like Serum or Phase Plant, something that's gonna allow you to cycle through the waveforms, right? So you see I'm going from sine to square to saw. And what we've done here is we've mapped LFO1 and set it to envelope mode so that it acts as an envelope. And basically, it's becoming a little bit of a square just at the start of the sound and then decaying to a little bit of a sine, right? So it's giving us some initial bite. It's making the sound a little bit fatter just at the start, but giving us a nice clean sound too. It's not too overpowering, right? So it's not taking up too much space in the mix, right? If I was to make this a saw and turn off the filter, right? It's not gonna really fit in the mix anymore. Versus this. And so what you can do now is start applying that same motion from LFO1 to other parts of the synth, right? To get a nice cohesive sound. So in this case, we've mapped it to a little bit of distortion as well, a little bit of drive there. And another thing you're gonna want for a sound like this, right, is a little bit of bounce, right? So just a little bit of initial bite from envelope 3 here, which we've mapped to the coarse. So a little bit of initial pitch bend, right? Just a little bit to give it an initial bite, right? So if I go crazy with this, you can really hear it. Right now it's sounding like a wild laser zap or something. And not really even in tune probably. So just a little bit, right? And then lastly, you can turn on your filter, right? So I think I maybe accidentally had the filter off while we were listening, but if you listen really closely with the filter off, there's some weird high frequencies, like some weird sizzle, that don't really sound like part of the sound. Envelope 2 here to the filter to clean up the sound a little bit. And one last thing to mention is that we just have a simple A, B, A, C bass pattern here. So call, response, or call, response, call, resolution. If you guys are feeling a little bit inspired after this video and want to start cooking up some house music, this is our house project file. You can get it for free and we'll link you below. Sounds like this. So next up, guys, we've got here what we're calling the cohesive unit bassline. And we wanted to put this one early on in the video because you're gonna hear it all the time in house music. And the idea is basically take your subline and use that same pattern for your melody or your chords, or maybe you have another mid bass layer on top of the sub. And so this is our subline. And now just pasting that over onto our melody channel, same exact pattern. Now we have this. Right, so it creates a lot of space in the mix, and it's also super easy to follow. You know, if you just look at a lot of modern house MIDI patterns, especially tech house, you know, it's usually a little bit up from the root note, a little bit down, small little stutters like this, but nothing too crazy or too hard to follow. And so one really good example of this tactic is Dom Dolla's Rhyme Dust. If you listen, you hear he's got the sub layer and then something in the mids on top of it, but it sounds like one cohesive unit, right? And so it creates a ton of space in the mix. Right, so when those vocal hits and the perks come into the mix, it's super clear, right? Because there's nothing really competing with it. It's just one cohesive bass line and then the little hits. All right, guys, so now we are on to dueling bass lines here. And the idea here is basically you're going to start with just one bass line. So we've got this. And you're going to use some of the notes in this pattern. And so, for example, maybe I would take every other note and mute it. And those notes would now be used on a second channel that's similar but slightly different synth. So we still have our saw buzzer here, but now it's like roughly half the notes, and then we've got this deep fuzz. So now we're sounding like this. Right, so it creates this little offset groove, like this little back and forth type motion. And it's not something that you might necessarily even notice in a lot of tracks, especially when, say I take this saw buzzer, I make a second saw buzzer, and I change just something very, very slight, like I add a slightly different high end. Like right now, the high end in each of these basses is slightly different. So within the context of the track, right, if I turn on everything, you might not even notice. Meaning you might not even notice unless you're paying really close attention as a producer, to the bass lines. But it can add a nice little touch, right? And a nice little bit of extra interest in each phrase. And another thing to keep in mind here is this technique can be used for subs. It can be used for leads, right? You're basically checkerboarding, right? You're using two similar but slightly different synths instead of one. And so, yeah, we called it dueling bass lines. We have some of, we kind of wanted to give some of these cool names or whatever, but it's really not dueling because they're not fighting with each other. It's kind of more complementary bass lines, but you get the idea. So, I'm always giving stuff unique names so that when I want to recall it later, pull it in from my clip library in Ableton, I just know that this one is, maybe I would call this dueling buzzers, right? Or something very memorable so that when I want to use it in the future, I can just quickly remember and pull it in. So now we're slowing down a bit. We're at 122 BPM and we're looking at some deeper FM style basses. So this is what we got. And just soloing the basses now. So it creates a nice deep sound, a nice chill floor for your track. And so you're going to hear this in a lot of deep house. And usually it's just basic sine on sine frequency modulation. So looking in this patch here, we have oscillator A, which is basically a sine wave. And then oscillator B, the volume is actually turned all the way down, but it's acting as an FM modulator for oscillator A. So down here in Serum, you can turn FM from B on. You could also turn on FM from sub if you want to use the sub as an FM modulator. And I have this harmonic series waveform here. I like this because if you boost the wavetable position, you can see it's kind of just going up through the octaves essentially. So it's not that different from just boosting the octaves here, but you can get more control over it. So essentially I've mapped this LFO3 to the wavetable position and we get this little staircase motion. So just looking at what's happening here. So we're getting slightly different FM amounts. And if you just hold shift, you can just draw in different staircases. Right? So you can quickly find something that fits your track. Those high ones might be a little bit too crazy if we were going for like a chiller, deeper vibe, but if we're making some UK or something more aggressive with more energy, maybe we would experiment with a little bit more aggressive FM. And so this patch, other than that, I'm going to go to my original patch just so we can get the original settings back. But basically, we have a couple other things going on that are giving us that deeper sound. So the main one is the delays. So if I turn off the delays, we got this. Right? Kind of static, kind of boring. And then with the delays, right? Much more soulful and deep. So just dialing in your filter, we're only letting in some of the mid-range for the delays, a little bit of feedback, but it can give you a nice little, kind of soulful, ethereal vibe when you dial in the delays on a bass. And then we have a little bit of EQ notch as well. So with it off, with it on. So it's just bringing out those mid frequencies a little bit. And then the last thing in this patch is basically LFO1 here. is just going up. So over the course of 2 bars, we're mapping alpha 1 to the release amount. So it's giving us like a little bit of mini tension and release in each 2-bar phrase here. The first notes have a shorter release, and the ones at the end have a little bit of a longer release, so they're ringing out a little bit more. So now moving along to a different section of the sketch of this track. If the piece we just looked at is maybe the first drop and this is the break, this is how I'm envisioning that things can maybe transition. So these smooth glides right here in the red, it's basically the same patch that we just looked at, the deep FM one, but I've just filtered it down a bit to make it a bit smoother. I've pulled back on the FM, and I've also added some glides. So this port knob here, it's taking 40 milliseconds for this A note to glide up to this A, this E to glide up to this E, etc. So before, we kind of just had these little staccato stabs, so I just made them a little bit longer, right? And we have a little bit of glide now. So just going along with that idea of like doing more with the sounds that you've already made, as I'm thinking about, the second drop, which I haven't really sketched out at all, I'm probably just going to use something similar as the deep FM patch, but I'm just going to have more FM, more mids and high frequencies, more energy. Maybe it'll be a faster pattern, something like this. Right? I haven't really thought it out yet, but just having that general idea in your head of kind of how the track is going to progress, and sort of, how do you want the energy levels to progress? Do you want it to be fairly static, kind of just like a lounge track that's playing in the background? Or do you want it to be like a track you can play in a DJ set that really ramps up in energy? Maybe you could go from deep house to progressive with this track. So just something to keep in mind as you're sort of sketching out what you want the track to be when it's finished and done and kind of like sitting in your DJ library. If you guys are feeling the deep vibes, this is a really useful article on our website. It's just a quick 5-minute read. It's going to give you a background on the genre. It's going to give you kind of recommendations for the type of drums you might want to use, the types of synths you might want to use, right? Electric pianos, Rhodes pianos, chords often borrowed from jazz and funk scales, etc., etc. So continuing with the idea of FM synthesis, but going just a bit more wild with it, we have here an example of something you'd hear in a more aggressive house track or something like UK or night bass, something higher energy, right? So we're back up to 132 BPM, and this is what we got. So to dial in a patch like this, you're going to want to use operator, and you're going to want to put it in the default serial mode, right? So by default, if I click these little boxes over here, it's set up as a series. So oscillator B flows into A, C flows into B, and D flows into C. Versus parallel mode, right? If I set this to over here, the parallel, they're all going to output separately. So it's going to sound very different. Right? If I mute B and C, it'll just be our initial sine wave. So series mode, and basically I usually just start cranking the level, fine, and coarse knobs until I find the pocket, right? Finding the timbre that you want for your track. Right? Your kind of basic wub sound there. You could start LFOing some of these knobs if you want. I'm kind of moving it with my mouse to LFO it, but you get the idea, right? So just find the pocket that you want for the timbre of your sound. And then here, it's basically just 2 channels. So the one we listened to, right here, I have it arping up a little bit. So I have the arpeggiator on, and I've automated it up here, versus over here, it's just staying at the root note. And then I have basically the same channel here. The only difference with this one, sounds like this. The only difference here is I've added a filter, right? So in sound design, always reach for filters if you want to change the timbre a bit or maybe add another layer. I have just the reverb filter in Serum. If we see what this looks like, I'm going to go to the reverb filter. Well, it's all grayed out, but you can kind of see it through there, right? Reverb filter. And so now we have 2 layers. Or if you just want the 1 layer for a cleaner sound, you can go with that. But basically, the idea here is add a little bit of aggression with some wilder FM. And one other thing to note is you can get a little bit off the grid. So just looking at my MIDI pattern, see like this note right here, this one over here, this one over here. They're not right on the grid. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I will just, play in notes from my keyboard and record them. And then you can use the quantize function to either snap them to the grid directly, or in Live 12, you can quantize by a certain amount. So if I go to quantize and then I did Control A, and I'll turn off auto for a second so it doesn't do it yet. But if I say I want to quantize to the grid halfway, so 50%, I can do Control A and then transform. So now they've moved 50% closer to the grid, right? I'm going to undo it and then redo it, undo and then redo. So if you feel like things are out of time, you can quantize it by a little bit so that it sounds more in time. But yeah, add a little bit of wonkiness to the beat, a little bit of a bite with some FM. And yeah, you got yourself a little aggressive house track. Alrighty, friends, that's pretty much it for today. Definitely hop in the comments, let us know what you liked, maybe even what you didn't like. And yes, I hope you guys are going to get that house project file that we linked to below and start cooking up some absolute pure fuego. Peace.